Housing it's a hot button topic at the moment. No matter who you are, it's become increasingly unaffordable, and rent is going crazy in so many different cities in so many different countries across the world. There have been protests in New York, in Spain, in Canada, and the UK, all around this idea of affordable housing. It's gotten so bad now that rent is actually unaffordable in the US for around half of all renters. Rents have been rising for the fastest rate in decades in the UK. Homelessness has also been rising along with these increasing rents. Some people blame Airbnb, some people blame a lack of supply, some people blame Wall Street. All of these different explanations are valid to a certain degree. A lack of supply, zoning codes, and corporate buyers are all reasons why housing is getting more expensive. But today I want to talk about this one company, realpage. Arguably the worst company in the world, didn't hear that from me. They present another dimension that helps to give you a fuller picture of the housing crisis. So realpage describes itself as a provider of property management software, data analytics, and services to efficiently manage rental properties and real estate. But they are so much more than this, okay? They are so much more than this. If you have heard of this company, it's likely because they've been embroiled in a number of lawsuits. They settled $3 million in charges with the Federal Trade Commission. They've been sued time and time again. And the most recent lawsuit that they've been involved in has been brought forward by the Department of Justice in the USA, along with 8 individual states who've decided to join this lawsuit, accusing them of effectively running a housing cartel. Specifically because of this one piece of software they have called the YieldStar. And YieldStar collects information from a bunch of different landlords, information about all the leases that they have going on in the building, the occupancy rates of their building, which units are empty, which units are full, and combines it with publicly available data. And it has the result, in their own words, of maximizing asset performance. That's what they describe it as. I'm sure you can figure out what that means. It just means it uses an algorithm to figure out whether or not they can get away with charging more. If you live in North America, Europe, or Asia, you might live in one of the 24 million units that's managed by realpage. And there's a chance that your landlord is using this algorithm to effectively charge the absolute maximum possible and to collude with other landlords in order to do the same. In one analysis, they found that around 30 to 60% of apartment units in some American markets used realpage to manage their properties. The largest property manager in the US is a company called Greystar, and they even found that by using this software, even in a downturn, their rentals outperformed the market by 4.8%. One executive from the company who operates this software was asked whether he believed the software had a role to play in housing prices. And this is what he answered.
We are seeing unprecedented rent growth, 14.5% growth, lease over lease on new leases. Never before have we seen these numbers. So Andrew, I'll start with you. What is the role of revenue management in some of the price growth we're seeing right now?
Well, I think it's driving it, quite honestly, because when you think about, as a property manager, very few of us would be willing to actually raise rents double digit within a single month by doing it manually. So that opportunity to actually review price systemically on a day-to-day basis with optimized rents is what's driving that growth, in my opinion.
There are a bunch of quotes like this where you read them and you ask yourself, like, do these people hear what they're saying? Because this sounds like supervillain stuff. One of the developers of the algorithm actually said that it was conceived to solve the problem of leasing agents having too much empathy compared to computer-generated pricing. And this software eliminated empathy from the equation of housing people. And I don't know if any of you have ever had to interact with a leasing agent or an estate agent, but empathy isn't the word I'd normally use to describe them. Some of the recommendations that come from this software are things like not filling every bit of housing that you have because it allows you to charge a higher rate on the other units. They also suggested that landlords adjust some people's leases to 13 months in order to reduce the overall supply throughout the year. If you want to see what the industry thinks of this, what these corporate landlords actually think of this software, Rick Campo, who is the CEO of Camden Property Trust, the company that owns more than 62,000 rental units, had this to say after adopting the software. The net effect of driving revenue and pushing people out was $10 million of income. I think that shows that keeping heads in the beds above all else is not always the best strategy. This is like Lex Luthor, supervillain stuff. When he said this, he didn't think he was the bad guy until people found out he said this, and then he claimed that he totally didn't mean that pushing people out of their houses was a good idea. This is deplorable, obviously, but being an unethical company isn't enough to get you sued. And I think it's worth understanding exactly what they're being sued for, because they're not the only company who does this. So their number one competitor is a company called Yardi that had software that was literally called Rent Maximizer. This software was used to price 8 million units in 2013. So nobody at any point thought, maybe we should pick a different name. The real problem is that housing has become consolidated within fewer and fewer hands. Corporate landlords have been getting bigger and bigger year on year. And as these landlords get bigger and bigger, they hold more and more power over the market, especially in smaller areas and more isolated areas. And what these landlords have realized is that working together actually beats competing against each other. It's in everyone's best interest to collaborate and to share information rather than try to outcompete the competition. Unfortunately, this idea of working together with your competition is the literal definition of a cartel, an association of manufacturers or suppliers that collaborate instead of competing, with the sole purpose of maintaining prices at a high level and restricting competition. If we take a second to go over the actual lawsuit, you see there's some banger lines in this complaint. So the US is suing this company realpage because it has an estimated 80% market share over this kind of revenue management software. And the government alleges that it's trying to monopolize the market and to unlawfully decrease competition amongst this housing market. This is a quote from a landlord who used realpage, who used this software. He said, I always like this product because your algorithm uses proprietary data from other subscribers to suggest rents and terms. That's classic price fixing. It honestly baffles me that people like type this, they read it, and they're like, yeah, that sounds good, and hit send. Some other banger quotes include them saying that their software is driving every possible opportunity to increase price, and a rising tide raises all ships. The tide being an ever-increasing sea of money from renters. Yeah, that's pretty spot on. In this complaint, they make a reference to a quote that was given by Maureen Olhausen, who was a former chair of the FTC. And she gives us like a really handy way to think about what these algorithms are doing. Because when we think of a cartel, you might think of a shady group of businessmen meeting around a table, like an Illuminati type setup. But we live in the age of technology. And so there's no need for all of these independent operators to ever actually physically meet. They can collude via an algorithm. So she says, everywhere the word algorithm appears, please just insert a guy named Bob. Is it okay for a guy named Bob to collect confidential price strategy information from all the participants in a market and tell everyone how they should price? If it isn't okay for a guy named Bob to do it, then it probably isn't okay for an algorithm to do it either. If such a guy, this Bob existed, he'd be described as a mafia boss. That's what they did, right? It can feel maybe a bit impersonal, a bit abstract to describe this software as like increasing rents or whatever. But I think it becomes a bit more like visceral when you look at the effect on specific markets and specific places. And I do think that Seattle is a really good example of how this is literally affecting people's lives. ProPublica, the news outlet that has been reporting on this company for years, did an analysis of one neighborhood in Seattle and found out that 70% of apartments were overseen by 10 companies. And every single one of these companies used this software. 90% of increases are accepted. And they've even added like an auto accept feature. So the landlord doesn't even have to physically engage with the software. They just have to set it and forget it. It's all part of this effort to abstract away any kind of relationship between the landlord and between the tenant. Corporate landlords are clearly the problem, because they try harder and harder and harder to have a less and less and less personal relationship with the tenants. And, the less personal a relationship is, the less guilty you feel exploiting it. And I would struggle to argue that this is the only reason for housing increases. House prices have been going up for decades and decades across a number of different markets. But what I will say is that I'm not going to lose any sleep over this lawsuit, and that a company like this being targeted is just such a massive step in the right direction. It's so rare to see any kind of action directed towards these companies that exploit and abuse the process of renting. And so even seeing this one case is a good thing. And there actually has been progress in this space. I do want to highlight San Francisco, who recently became the first city in the US to ban the sale and the use of this kind of software within city limits. It is going to at least act as a dampener, and I can't be mad at this. The hidden side of software like this is that it plays into a bunch of other crises that are happening at the same time. A rental crisis isn't just a rental crisis. It's also a homelessness crisis. It's a drug epidemic. It's a quality of life decrease, and it has so many effects that knock on down the line that we don't think about. In the meantime, I will say, if you are a renter, I hope you have tipped your landlord today. They're carrying a lot of weight on their back, so, drop them a little extra 20, let them get something nice for themselves.